Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I came back from El Salvador this weekend. I was just there for a very short visit, and that country, as you know, has just marked 25 years from the signing of the peace accord that ended the Civil War. But the mood was not exactly celebratory in El Salvador, and there are deep problems. A country that's very polarized, governance challenges, lack of economic growth, and not many economic opportunities. Underlying all of these problems that the country is facing is massive insecurity and violence and crime. And the Maras, or gangs, are a central element or feature of this troubling situation. I guess it's hard to know the exact numbers of Maras. Maybe our experts would tell us, but certainly in the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, probably ranges about 70,000, something like that. There are estimates that are even higher, but obviously this is a very significant number that poses enormous problems for the country's progress. In El Salvador, at least from the people who I spoke to, the levels of homicides are apparently down somewhat in recent months, but they're still very, very high. And there are fundamental questions of territorial control that remain, that persist. And of course, beyond homicides, extortion, protection rackets are increasingly widespread and ingrained, and even extending, many say, to rural areas, whereas before they had been primarily concentrated in cities. As we know, there have been a variety of responses to the situation. In El Salvador, there was a truce for a while. There have been hardline approaches, so-called iron fist policies, others softer, but these approaches have not yielded positive and sustainable results. This phenomena, the Mara phenomena, is complex and evolving, but it's critical to get a better understanding of its nature and the lessons of policy approaches. This is particularly, I think, important in advance of a meeting that's coming up in Miami, I think June 14th and 15th, where the Vice President Pence will be, as well as Secretary of Homeland Security John Kelly and other senior officials of the Trump administration, to focus on the situation of the Northern Triangle countries and to share perspectives and ideas about the root causes of the migration issue that has certainly raised a lot of attention here in Washington, and to try to figure out what could be done to address them in relation and reference to the Alliance for Prosperity policy framework that has already been developed. The dialogue has a longstanding interest and concern with these issues, and this morning we're very happy to take advantage of the launch in Washington of a recent report, a very good report of the International Crisis Group, to deepen and enrich our discussion. The title of the report that all of you have copies of is Mafia of the Poor, Gang Violence and Extortion in Central America. The report not only offers a very clear-eyed and detailed diagnosis of what's going on, but also touches on some novel approaches that have been tried, including Guatemala's anti-extortion office, penal reform, and also some programs aimed at increasing economic opportunities. Have these fared well or not fared well? How are we doing on these different policies approaches? We're delighted to have with us this morning to share their perspectives Ivan Briscoe, who is the program director of the International Crisis Group for Latin America and the Caribbean. He's based in Bogota. He's been in that job for almost a year, but he has 20 years of experience in Latin America, looking at questions of politics, conflict, and crime. And he really coordinated the preparation of this report. So we're delighted to have Ivan with us in our new office. He presented a previous report in our other office, so we're very happy to welcome him back. And we're also delighted to have, for the first time, Anna Glenda Tager of Interpeace, which is an organization that has worked extensively on community-related aspects of the Mara presence. And Anna has detailed knowledge of the region and also has spent some time in the jails as well, interviewing a lot of people. So she has a very, she could provide a lot of flavor and a good perspective on this phenomena. And so we look forward to hearing Anna's insights as well. Finally, to start the discussion after the two presentations, we're thrilled to have with us a good friend, Steve Dudley, who is the co-director of Inside Crime. He's an expert on organized crime, drug trafficking, corruption, based in Washington, but travels extensively to the region and really does first-rate work that's widely recognized and respected. Steve and I met in Colombia, I think many, many years ago, where he was a journalist. And I can't resist mentioning that he's the author of one of the best books on Colombia's civil conflict called Walking Ghosts, Murder and Guerrilla Politics in Colombia. Really a superb book. Steve will provide some comments and maybe provoke us and stimulate our thinking, and then we'll invite all of you to pose questions and share your perspective as well on this important issue. So thank you very much. I also want to thank Jennifer. There's Jennifer? Oh, Jennifer Leonard, who's the director of the office here of the International Crisis Group, and of course our good friend Mark Schneider, who we collaborated with for many, many years, the Dialogue and the Crisis Group, who remains close to our work. So again, thank you all for coming. I look forward to a good discussion, and I'll turn it over to Ivan.
Thank you very much. This microphone works automatically. Yes. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Michael, for the opening. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Steve and Anna Glenda, for being here as well. I'd like to open with an apology and a caveat. The apology is that you might have been divided between coming here and coming to another presentation on the subject of Maras, on a report, a survey of Maras, which is being launched at the moment in another part of Washington. Fortunately, I'm going to make use of that report in some of my comments, so don't feel that you've missed out on it entirely. And the other is an apology or a warning that maybe the title of this presentation is a bit of a misnomer. We talk about new approaches to the Central American gangs, but the impression that you might gain if you spend some time in the Northern Triangle is that actually the entire region is stuck in some sort of Groundhog Day of repressive policies, and that really there are more old approaches than new approaches. By which I mean there are an estimated 13,000 soldiers taking part in mixed patrols on the streets of El Salvador to deal with the gang problem at the moment. Mano duro, iron fist, as we would call it in English, appears to be alive and kicking, particularly in Honduras and El Salvador. In Honduras, the current president seems to be proposing, well, most recently proposed, reducing the age at which young people can be criminally prosecuted. And of course, here in the United States, we have the prospect, or rather the reality, depending on your perspective, of a return to mass deportations of illegal, undocumented immigrants, and possibly including gang members. So we seem to be in some ways repeating the history we've seen for the last 20 years. What is the new, you might say? Well, I will try and come to that towards the end of my brief presentation. But I think, first of all, I'd like to lay out exactly what we try to do in this report, the report which you've got here. Why another report on this problem? There is a huge literature out there on Central American gangs which have been in existence in their current form, based around the Mara Salvatrucha and the Barrio 18, the two main gangs which you see across Central America. These have been around for 20 years. This is 2 decades. Many scholars, many journalists have been following their developments. What we have tried to do fundamentally is bring together two perspectives which often don't sit together in the same analysis. One of them is understanding the security issues involved, the criminal activities in which the Maras are involved, and the best security responses to those. And the other is understanding the Maras as a social phenomenon, as something which has deep roots and which gives certain meaning and identity to the individual members of these broader organizations. Understanding the why, the roots, the social roots, the anthropology, if you like, the ethnography of these different groups. And in doing so, in bringing these two together, we attempt to try and identify the best ways forward, not just to combat these gangs, but to try and understand the gangs from within. And the effort to do so is perhaps more urgent than ever, given the state of the Northern Triangle, the violence in the Northern Triangle, but above all, the violence in El Salvador. El Salvador is ground zero, the focal point of gang activity in Central America. El Salvador in 2015 and 16 had the highest murder rates in the world. The murder rate has since gone down. The government has claimed that this is a result of its policies, that this is a matter of some debate, but even so, it still remains extremely high, even in relation to other Latin American countries. And this murder rate is in large part down to gang violence and police brutality, or rather police repression of gangs. In Honduras and Guatemala, again, we see gang violence, but perhaps not accounting for exactly the same proportion of murders. So in bringing these together, these two perspectives, as I've said, the security perspective and the sociological perspective, we drew on the work of our analysts, one based in Guatemala, the other based, researching Honduras and El Salvador. And particularly, we benefited from collaboration with Anna Glenda's team at Interpeace, who know the region extremely well, who know the prisons very well, who have regular, constant contact with marreros and pandilleros, both in and outside jail, who know the problem from the inside. And that was a little bit the approach, the basis we went around researching this, understanding the way of life of the Maras and how best to deal with it. But this is a highly complex problem in which throwing easy policy recommendations out doesn't do a whole lot of good. And I will just want to identify three reasons why I think it's incredibly difficult to get a grasp of the full complexity of this gang problem. And the first of these is fundamentally the nature of violence in the region. We best understand violence in Central America as being a chronic problem, as a pattern of violence reproduced over the generations with different social, economic, psychological structures and mechanisms, which mean that over the generations, violent responses become embedded in the way people act. In her latest research, unfortunately, before she died, she went to Honduras and Guatemala, and she looked into the question of the social psychology of gangs. And what she found was that particularly in Honduras, the stigma which the young people, poor young people in poor communities lived under had become internalized, that they were actually living the perception of other people that they were marginalized, excluded, and dangerous people, and therefore they were reproducing that themselves. This makes it very difficult to come up with a policy approach to combat gangs in which the effect is not confirming the gang's identity as a collection of social outcasts and rebels. And this is one of the dangers which any policy approach comes up against. The second is the simple gap which exists between policy and reality. Obviously, we have seen over the course of the last 2 decades a series of iron fist policies, hardcore repressive measures based on mass detentions, often on very flimsy legal grounds, and a huge overcrowding of the prison system. It's worth bearing in mind that El Salvador has the third most overpopulated prison system in the world, I believe the first two are the Philippines and Haiti. 3 times as many people in El Salvador's prisons as actually there is capacity for. But security policies have failed in other ways as well. They may look good, they may be attractive to a public which demands strong responses, but the fact of the matter is the security institutions are often not up to the job. A well-known survey of a decade ago found that in Northern Triangle, in a survey of gang members in Northern Triangle, 77% of the gang members reported that they made payments to the police, so that the police were actually appeared to be systematically involved, taking cuts from the Maras criminal rackets. On the other side, I mean, it's very difficult just to criticize security policy when it's evident that the truce in El Salvador from 2012 to 2014 also failed. It was an effort, an honest and sincere effort, to bring about a negotiated settlement between the Maras primarily. And obviously there was, in a context where there was great public and state disbelief in this process, it was very difficult to make progress. But it's also very difficult to negotiate any form of settlement with gangs which retain and perpetuate criminal activities during the process. And obviously, for a certain number of these gang leaders, it was an opportunity to focus on strengthening their criminal activities. And the last and third complicating factor is obviously the context, the broader geopolitical context in which this issue of the gangs in Central America is being dealt with. I don't need, I think, for this audience to go into great depth on this issue, but it's quite clear that deportations were the seed of the modern gang phenomenon in Central America in the 1980s. We're talking about 60,000 deportees from 1993 to 1999 who were sent back to Central America, among them most of a large component of gang or immigrants with criminal records or with a membership who had been members of gangs. And these, effectively, their presence in Central America brought lots of scuffling, slightly low-intensity gangs who were already present in El Salvador and Honduras, dozens or even hundreds of small neighborhood gangs clustered together under the influence of these recent arrivals from the United States into the 2 main gang brands. And this is a part of history. Obviously, deportations after that were not as essential in the formation and dynamics of the criminal gangs. The criminal gangs were largely recruiting from their local communities after that. But there is a concern, a valid concern, that an increase in deportations now would have a similarly dynamic effect at a moment when the gangs might be, arguably, I will ask Anna Glenda maybe to comment on this, reaching the limit of their current model. The fact of the matter is, however, that it is violence in Central America and gang violence, which is part of that, an important part of that, which is driving, increasingly seems to be driving migration northwards. And it is the response to that migration which appears to be based on a model of deportation and border control, which far from, as it were, dealing with the original causes of the expulsion of people from the region, could, if badly handled, make that situation worse. So there is a counterproductive logic in the way the gang problem is situated in the broader international context at the moment. I'm just going to enter now a little bit into the content of the report. You've got it there, so I'm not going to over-elaborate. You're very welcome to read it if you wish to. We talk in the report about the history. We try and locate the problem within this 20-year cycle, which goes from the post-conflict dislocation and economic problems of the Northern Triangle countries to the period of deportations in the 1990s, to the iron fist policies which began in 2003 and 2004 in all of the 3 countries, leading to a huge growing prison population, conversion of the prisons into nodes and hubs of gang criminal activity, and a growing complexity and hierarchy in the criminal gangs. And then, of course, the truce in El Salvador, which at the time it took place, and I researched it a little bit at the time, was a source of optimism and hope, which seemed to represent a growing political identity, social identity of the gangs, which it would be possible to negotiate with, but then ended in very great disappointment and led to the worst violence El Salvador has seen for decades. So that is the broad historical sweep. But where do we stand today? What is the current state of gang and criminal violence in the Northern Triangle? And what can be possibly done about it from what we know? The first point, it's absolutely essential to bear in mind, and I don't think there is any way to dispute it. We've put the title on the report, The Mafia of the Poor, a slightly controversial way of putting it. But I think the surveys confirm this. And this survey, which you're unable to hear the results of in this other event, absolutely confirms it. This is 1,200 mareros in jail and out of jail interviewed over the last year in El Salvador. Comes up with the following findings in a very brief form. 70% of them come from households earning less than $250 a month. Half of them ran away from home by the age of 15. Very little education, very few jobs to speak of. This is not a one-off survey finding out that the gang members are poor, excluded, and marginalized. This is a systemic finding which we find again and again in numerous surveys and analysis by academics, journalists, or whoever. These gang members are fundamentally at the lowest rungs of their societies. They are, to a degree, if you like, victims of their societies. Tani Adams, the lady who I mentioned earlier, referred to them as social zeros. They have no space in their societies. These societies in the Northern Triangle are spatially segregated, so that you have neighborhoods which are fundamentally not connected or somehow regarded as no-go areas or not integrated with the main national economies. And they're also vertically segregated with very high levels of income equality from top to bottom. These people who are spatially excluded and at the bottom of the vertical income chart, if you like, look for mechanisms, means, fora to give themselves respect and to make friends and to feel a sense of family and belonging, which they do not have in their own homes because they are coming from fundamentally broken homes. If you look again at the surveys which were carried out, the MARA members are highly attached to family and the meaning of family. They are highly religious. They look in their gangs for respect and status and reputation, and above all for friendship. So in some ways, that the fundamentals, the motivational fundamentals of gang membership are actually, we can actually understand. We can actually identify with them. And I think it's very interesting to bear in mind when it comes to the question of inequality and exclusion. What one Guatemalan former police officer who was very experienced in negotiating extortion payments with the gangs, so he knows the gangs very well, said about the dynamics in his own country, which is quoted in the report. He said, "If we can't spread the nice parts of town to the poor parts of town, then it is only logical that when you travel from the nice parts of town to the poor parts, you have to pay a tax." So this is in some ways, he is in himself reflecting the very logic of the situation. That said, the other element, of course, is that these are violent criminal organizations, and there's no point, as it were, denying such a thing. Anna Glenda is going to talk, I believe, a little bit about connections to drug trafficking, which exist, but are not sort of systemic and organic. They're not fundamental to the identity of these organizations. What is fundamental to the way these organizations operate, gain money, and control territory is extortion. Extortion in their communities and extortion in territories. the nature of the control over communities, which goes hand in hand with extortion, is quite extraordinary. In fact, if you read or study how gangs try to control members who have calmed down, which means they have left active gang membership and are no longer active in the gangs, one of the best ways to actually leave the gangs in this way is by joining an evangelical church. The problem is the other gang members constantly monitor these ex-gang members to check whether they're drinking, whether they're smoking, whether they have a nice time, whether they go to parties. This is an integral part of the gang's control mechanism of ex-gang members, which is in itself expressive of the level of control exercised over the communities in which the gangs are operating. This level of control goes hand in hand with extortion. And we do know in the report quite a lot about the extortion economies. These have been heavily investigated. We know that those who benefit from these extortion rackets, the gang members, get paid very little indeed, tiny, miserable incomes which are provided for all the different gang members. And the fact that they are economies which pay so badly might suggest that here is a possibility to convert illicit extortion activity into formal economic activity. And I hope Anna Glenda will mention some of the initiatives which have actually been carried out in this respect and which proliferated at the time of the El Salvador truce, trying to turn these extortion rackets, paying misery wages, into formal economic opportunities. But I don't want to keep a rosy-tinted picture of the gangs by talking about, small-scale incomes for the extortion. These extortion economies are fundamentally linked to some of the most outrageous acts of violence that these gangs have carried out. The 500 or so bus drivers killed in Guatemala from 2009 to 2011. Similar numbers of transport workers killed in El Salvador. The 100 or so taxi drivers who were being killed in Honduras every year a few years ago. The systemic threats against businesses. And of course, the link to forced displacement from the region, which again is a consequence of the tight control over communities and the extortion rackets which represent this control. According to the latest report of only a few weeks ago from Médecins Sans Frontières, 50% of people are leaving, of the immigrants leaving the Northern Triangle countries are doing so because of violence. I have very little time left, Michael.
No,
1 minute.
no time.
No time whatsoever. I will leave the question of current policy, but I would just say one or two things very quickly. We propose in this report that although the truce is in disgrace and although there is very significant opposition across all countries to any form of negotiation with the gangs, there is a case to be made for establishing some form of signaling, at the very least, between states and gangs in an effort to pacify these countries. An understanding. There doesn't need to be any face-to-face talks at the moment, but at least some confidence-building measures in which the state could register that it is willing to address some of the socio-economic roots of the gang phenomenon in exchange for gang promises to withdraw from their most abhorrent acts of violence. This is a start. We also look at the question of development programs in the most affected communities, obviously because of their levels of poverty and exclusion, more sophisticated investigations, and obviously a new prison policy. I can't actually say any more because I think Michael's had enough. I will leave it there, and thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much, Ivan. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. You've raised lots of issues, and I think given a good sense of the complexity and dimensions of this issue. Why don't we turn to Anna now for some remarks, and then.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I think I want to start with what Ivan was saying before. Why another report on this issue when this issue is too, investigated by a lot of academic groups, by the governments, by the civil society? But I think for me there is one answer that is very easy to find, and is that until now, even a lot of studies and a lot of people that is involved on that. Still, there is not clear a lot of things on the phenomenon, because I think if the things are clear, you can give an answer and you can have you cannot continue with the same problem. I think one issue that for us is important is what is the phenomena of the gangs and what the society did or does about this phenomena, which is totally different, because one thing is to understand really what is the phenomena, another is what is all this, a lot of information and a lot of paradigms about ideas about what this is really is. This means that for us, the youth gangs phenomena respond for a specific context. Depend of the context is how this is really functioning. It's not the same when you talk about Guatemala, when you talk about El Salvador, or when you talk about Honduras. And this is not because just about the youth gang as a group. It's because the context that you have in every country, even the 3 countries, we can talk about the North Triangle and we can talk like if it's the same place, the same area, the same context, but in the reality it's not true. The other point is that you always talk about youth gangs in general. And for us, there are a lot of differences, even not just between the countries, but also between the groups. It's not the same when you talk about the 18, Barrio 18, that is a more, for us, opportunistic gang that is more going for possibilities to survive. When you talk about the Mara Salvatrucha, the MS, that is a more sophisticated group in the 3 countries. Also, you can find another smaller groups of youth gangs in El Salvador in some ways, in Guatemala in others, and even in Honduras. We are looking right now like a new dynamics of this kind of groups. There is a new group that we can mention that is called Los Chirizos. That is another new group that you can find in the case of Honduras. And then with this, what you find is that depend of the context is how the phenomenon is mutating. And it's why sometimes when you have an understanding about the groups, after some years, these dynamics can change and the dynamics in the state can change. And then, of course, in the group, you can find differences with what you found in the past. What for us difference the youth gangs from the organized crime is more related with the social base of the youth gangs that you can find. Especially you can see with big difference when you talk about organized crime or you talk about the mafia, you can see a centralization of the accumulation of the capitals. In the case of the gangs, this is not, they function in a different way. They are not going from the top to the down. What they are using is the different cliques are operating, and they have some capital that after they give us a support to the top of the gang. Then it's like a community in which they support each other more than a structure in which is coming from the top to the down, all the lines of the accumulation of the capital. And it's why it's totally different if you compare. The other point is related with the territorial dynamics. You can find difference of the control of the territory depending of each country. And this depends also about the criminal organizations that you have in every country. In the case of El Salvador, by example, when we were working more directly with them, it was that they have a lot of territory control in what is calling the, how you call the fronteras invisibles, invisible borders. I'm sorry. What you call invisible borders, that you have every municipality in the country that is totally controlled by every group. You have the 18 the 18 group that is divided in two, the Revolucionarios and the Sureños, and you have the MS, and you have also another smaller groups that are in the country, and you have some municipalities that are divided in four, controlling by each group. And this means that people that is living in one area of the town cannot go into the other area because the area is controlled by the other group. And just because you live in one of the areas of the group, you cannot go into the other area because you can be killed. And also you need to have some type of support of your own area group that is operating in your area in order to go with the support of your group in all the negotiation. And this is very important to understand because you can find this in El Salvador in a very, very specific way, and even is why it was important for the truce, when it was the moment of the truce between the gangs, to maintain the control of the levels of the homicide rates. This is not exactly the same in the case of Honduras, and also is not the case in Guatemala. What is important is the whole issue of the social control, and how they have this social control in the territories, and how this social control is not in a competition with the state. Sometimes it's complementary to the state. And then have a social function into the society. Even if you listen in a very strange way, in the reality, this is what is really happening. The other point is related with the extraction of resources and how this extraction of resources is linked with the power that you can have in the control of some specific territory. And how the issue of the youth gangs have this control in a different way with other more sophisticated groups, because they are doing extraction of these resources for a very poor people. They are not taking from people or for big groups that have a lot of money. They are taking from a very marginal population and a very poor population. I would like to mention the link between the youth gangs with the politics, especially in the case of El Salvador. A lot of people was talking about how much power the truce gave to the youth gangs at some point, and to give like a political management or political control. But I think it's important to make different differences between the youth gangs and their relationship with the political parties, and when you talk about the youth gangs as a political group. In regard with the relationship that they have with the political parties, is different between the three countries. In the case of El Salvador, I think was very, very clear, especially if you follow some of the videos that appear in El Faro, most of them. And even I think in the case of Inside Crime, yeah, they published some, in which there are a lot of negotiations between the youth gangs and some politicians from not just the political party that is right now in the power, but also a political party that is in the opposition. And a lot of negotiations between them, talking about votes, exchanging by money, or some type of negotiations of prerogatives that they can have from the government. But this is not something new for us. If you see the history of Central America, there are a lot of networks of clientist networks, in which is a way of the management between the politicians and some groups in the society. Could be criminal groups or not criminal groups, but in general, this is the type of negotiations and links that you can find in different ways. And we can find even right now that we are working with the sport clubs in the case of Honduras, and we have a lot of information in the way that they negotiate things. And they are not youth gangs, and they are not in a truce. And then, it's the way that they have this kind of negotiation. The difference for us with the youth gangs, when they talk that they are politicians, is that they don't have a real political program. They don't have an interest in the political program. What they want is to see, especially the biggest or the oldest one, what they want is to see a different life for their sons, for their kids, because they can understand that they don't have too much exits. They can just go to the jail or to the cemetery, and they are clear on that. But of course, this is not the same situation in the youth ones. The youth ones want to live la vida loca, still they are not clear about why it's important to have a change. And you can work on a change or transformations with them if you go through the older ones, but it's not too easy to go just through them when they are just beginning living this life of violence. What is very important is all this relationship from them with the crime, but their relationship with the politics, and also for us, their relationship with the security forces. And in regard with the security forces, also depend of every country, it's different. In the case of Honduras, you can find a police that is part of the network of extortions, and they are part of this network with all the youth gangs, not just with one or other. In general, they have the relationship with all of them. In the case of Guatemala, you can find a relation to extortion from one group to the others. By example, from the jails, you can find a lot of control of the extortions in the streets. And this is handled from the jails, not especially from the youth gangs, because the jails are controlled by some ex-militaries or foreign militaries. In these groups, extortion the youth gang, and then the youth gang extortion the others in order to receive the funds to pay to the others. Then it's an extortion to the extortion, if you want to say in one way. I don't know if it's comprehensive. Monopoly in relationship of the crime, but this is a more individual, in an individual way, and is not something that is as a group, like in the case of Honduras. What is the relationship of those groups with the narco traffic? What we can see in the case of the region is that because the youth gangs is an opportunistic group that is looking for business and how they can survive from that business. In Guatemala, what we find is that they never could be a competitor of the big networks that came from the 70s, especially militaries related with this kind of networks. In the case of El Salvador, we can find that the narco traffic is marginal. It's not something that you can find very easy, like you can find in Guatemala or in Honduras, especially because it's in a place that is just the route to have the drugs to the north, but it's not exactly a place in which you can find people that is highly consuming the drugs and that needs to have other type of market. Of course, there are some type of narcomenudeo, how you said in English? Yeah, it's a small scale of yeah. And then you can find this because when we were very related with the truth process, it was some groups that were most of the groups or the cliques were more related with extortions. Then it was more easy to give like another option to change. But there was smaller groups of cliques that were more related with the narcomenudeo, sorry. In those cases, it was more difficult for us to try to work with them and to try to convince them to come into a process, because the level of the winning that they had from that, it was very, very high, and then they had not interest to be in a process in which they could have a change with something that is not giving to them a real opportunity with the same level of income that they had at that point. In the case of Honduras, is even if it's a territory that it was more a transit territory, the networks are more recently, and that allows to the gangs that they can have a more disputes in their space. You can see the MS controlling the whole monopoly of the narcomenudeo, and this is information that we have even from the sport clubs and the other groups, and how much they control there. But the point is how the state responds to that, and how much the state is sometimes part of the transformation of the same phenomenon, because the way that they answer to that. And I don't want to go too deeply into that because I have the timing. But I think one of the issues is in the last couple of months, more or less, there is a lot of debate in the region about the reforms in the penal code. They name the gangs as a terrorist groups, to have extraordinary measures, especially in the case of El Salvador from the FMLN, and the use of the armed forces to combat them. That is something that we can see that they used to use as something that is important to sell that the government is doing something against them. What is the problem that we find? That all those measures are trying to show that they are doing something, but at the end, it's just like we said cortina de humo in Spanish. That is, a smoke screen. It's something that is not real. Yesterday, before I came here, I was listening the news in Guatemala that Mariscal Zavala is one of the jails in Guatemala that is having right now the VIP members of the society in jail, because this is a military quartel, but that is using as a jail for the VIP members of the jail. And our ex-president and vice president are there, just to give you one type of titles of the people that we have there. And one of the ladies that it was called La Patrona, that it was linked with extortions, narco traffic, and so on, it was there. And at some point last week, someone support her to go outside of the jail. Nobody knows where she is right now, when supposedly it was the armed forces, the ones that it was giving the support to the jails and the security to the jails. And yesterday, in some type of follow-ups that the police and the General Attorney Office it was doing in Guatemala, they find one member of the youth gangs that they took, that he had an official membership in the armed forces, and he was part of the group of people that it was giving the security to Mariscal Zavala, that is this jail. Then you can say, how is this? How is a formally military person that is giving a security to the jail as part of the youth gang, 18 youth gang, that they are just taking right now? How is possible? Of course, the armed forces said that they are having infiltrations of the youth gang, but I think it's more on the contrary, especially because our experience that the La Rueda, that is this group of the leaders of the youth gangs, when we have more relationship with them, we knew that it was 3 foreign militaries inside of La Rueda. And then always it was talking about the link between some militaries with them. And then this gives a lot of confusions in terms of how you will do this if you want to see the phenomenon as the bad guys and the good ones. Or if you want to understand the context, you want to understand the phenomenon inside of that kind of society and how it is related and involved in the whole spectrum of the society to give an answer, because if not, it's impossible. If you just see this from the point of view of the criminal, the criminal point of view, because then it's impossible to combat. We have a lot of years going in that way, and really it's impossible. And then for us, I think if we try to understand different the problem, then I think we can begin to succeed in what we are doing from the state, from the civil society, and from the different areas. And then it's the context that will make the conditions for that. And also how we need to change the paradigm of the prevention, especially primary prevention. That is what we most are, all the international community and then governments are doing, and the civil society, more than work with them, try to understand the dynamics of the violence and the crime, and try to give a specific answer depending on that. And this implies, of course, to talk with them, to understand them, and to give to them the capacity also to give possibilities or answers to see how to resolve this problem that they are causing. I think I am here because I am out of time. And in the questions, we can have more time.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was great. Appreciate it. Yeah, we're a little tight on time, but we're going to hear from Steve, and then we're going to open up to all of you. Steve?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good morning. Thanks, Michael. Thanks to Dialogue again, and thanks, of course, to ICG for doing this great report. It's it's great to be next to Ivan and Ana Glenda, of course. Before I give a couple of reflections, just I think a quick story that kind of is emblematic of the gang phenomenon in of itself. As part of what has now become a 3-year project to study the MS-13 in 3 different geographic spaces: El Salvador, Los Angeles, and the greater Washington area, working with American University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. And we're speaking to a lot of gang members. One of the gang members I met just a few weeks ago in a detention center in Houston was a guy named Alejandro. Alejandro had been a gang leader for about 12 years and really was one of these guys who had 9 lives. And I mean that figuratively and literally. He's a guy who at one point he'd taken a knife to the stomach. He had a knife go through right up next to his neck. And at one point he actually had a machete hit him in the head from a rival gang leader. And as he lay on the ground, he thought, well, the next one is the final blow. This is it. And so he kind of prepared his body, but instead of feeling that final blow, he felt a tug on his foot. And he couldn't quite figure it out, so he kind of leans back and he looks down and he sees the guy has the machete underneath his arm and he's taking his shoes off. So he's trying to steal his shoes. And I say to him, well, why was he trying to steal the shoes? And he says, because they were LA gear. They were LA gear high tops. They'd come from Los Angeles. This was a very prized possession in the gang world. And just at that time, another car came whizzing by, shoots in the air. He says shots went out in the air, and the rival gang member got afraid and ran away, and Alejandro lived to tell the tale. This is part of this very strange and odd, sad relationship, really, many of these gang members have with the United States. This sort of fascination, on the one hand, with the everything that comes with the United States, and what the United States, the devastation the United States, has on their lives in various respects, not just the sort of interventions that Ivan alluded to back in the 1980s that caused the first, major wave of migration, but in which Alejandro's entire family left. His dad, after he left his mom, had already left the family, stayed in El Salvador, but all of his older brothers and sisters went to the United States, at which point he says to me, my family became the gang, of course. And this is a reflection also in the report that Ivan alluded to as well. And then the different ways in which Alejandro's life is this sort of various lives. I mean, these gang members, they're not just sort of, one type of person. There's Alejandro, when he's in El Salvador, he's a gang leader. He goes to the United States a couple different times, and he works in the legal sphere. I mean, he works in a restaurant for a while. He works in construction. He works in a Levi's factory. He doesn't have any connection to the gang. He's what's called sort of calmao, or semi-retired. And then he's forced to go back to El Salvador a couple of times because his family members, including his wife, get sick. And so he goes back willingly. He's not deported or anything like that. His relationship with violence, he claims anyway, is very different. He entered the gang in the 1990s when you didn't have to necessarily execute someone. So when he gets out of jail in 2012, he's tasked by the gang, a gang that has evolved into a really extremely violent organism, asks him to commit a murder, at which point he says he balks. And then he gets in trouble with the gang and he starts to sort of try and get out of the gang, and then he's faced with the prospect of being executed by the gang, which is what leads him into the Houston Detention Center. So he's kind of a reflection of all these different complexities that we see in the gang, and I think that this is what we're trying to get at when we're talking about gangs these days. We need to see the nuance, we need to see the complexities, and I would offer that this report gets at a few of these incredibly powerful and important complexities. So I'd offer just sort of three major contributions that I think the report makes. One is this idea about protection. What is protection? What does protection mean in these neighborhoods? What does protection mean for these particular private businesses? Because it's not just, the corner store. They have reflections about the way in which these gangs interact with private businesses, which I think is really important. What does protection mean in this context in which you cannot trust the authorities, or that the gang next door is much more violent than perhaps the gang that you perceive is in your neighborhood. We saw an example of that when we did a study for Insight Crime and in Honduras, where there were a number of stories about how the MS-13 was going after blonde-haired women. And the reports in the media were that they were attacking anyone with blonde hair. They have no morals. That's it. It's all over. Anyone blonde hair is going to be their target. When, as it turned out, if you dug a little bit deeper, what you found was that the rival gang next door, the Chorizos in this case, there was sort of a trend in their gang that their girlfriends would dye their hair blonde. And those same girlfriends were the ones who were going and collecting the extortion money from the central market. So then the gang, the MS-13, was really literally responding to the blonde-haired women who were extorting the central market, where they felt like that they had control. So this is the sort of complexity that I think that we can start to get at, and obviously goes towards the heart of a lot of criminal theory, most notably Diego Gambetta's whole idea of protection, the protection racket being the sort of core essence of the beginnings of any mafia type group. The second contribution I think that is very important to consider in this, it's a little bit buried, I would bring it up a little bit more, is this whole idea of what it is to be a man. What is the perception of being a male in these societies, and how it is particularly manifest in the relationship to women, and the way in which they are a prop at best in this world. It was so interesting. Alejandro has the gang member I met in Houston Detention Center has 3 girls. And I asked him, I said, well, what really made you at the end of the day want to leave the gang now, for real, leave the gang? And he says, well, I had a son. And I was just taken by my son, and I held my son, and this and that about his son. Which is going at this whole idea of being a male, being a man in these particular spaces, and the way in which that is expressed so crudely within the gang through these violent initiation rites. The way in which you move up in the gang is by committing extremely violent acts, by illustrating that you are more man than the next. That manifestation also comes out in their relationship with women. So I think that this is an important aspect. I like the fact that they broke out a section on women. I think this is a very important aspect going forward, and also plays in a little bit to the survey, in the sense that this dichotomy, another dichotomy that the gangs present to us, is this whole idea of what they value the most is family, right? What they value the most is their mothers, and that was what came out in that survey. But at the same time, they go an extremely far way towards destroying that same family. And then the third contribution is one that Ivan said right at the beginning, is this whole idea of just this the circular nature of this issue, the way in which we feel like we're right back where we started, this idea of that vigilantism, antiism, and mano dura are the only answers to this, or seemingly the only answers to this. This is really the most disheartening part of this. And not only is it disheartening because of its results, but because it actually seems to, from the information we've been able to gather, it seems to point in the other direction. It actually ends up strengthening the gangs. It ends up strengthening not just their sort of proverbial resolve, but also within the prison system, for example, we know very well that they reestablished their hierarchies. They were able to set up these sort of cells of operation. And reestablish a control and really sort of mature in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have otherwise. It's good to see that other places like Guatemala and I think to a certain extent Honduras are experimenting with different possibilities. I think that the Honduras experiment, there are various different experiments with lowering violence levels that I think need to be studied more. So I would give them a little bit more due. And there's certainly this idea as it relates just to policing, this idea of hotspot policing is being tried all over. Unfortunately, it's going to be hard to kind of move to the next level, maybe a more focused deterrence approach of the type David Kennedy's of the world are pushing about, just because there is an extreme dearth of data available to apply that type of policing approach, unfortunately, something that we found when we did a deep dive into homicides and tried to measure how many homicides we could attribute to gang members. It's just this, deep dearth of ability to gather and understand or analyze the data. The interesting thing there was it wouldn't necessarily take that many more resources. They have all the resources in place, but what happens, and this happens in a lot of issues, of course, is everything is driven towards the political end. What is that data used for? Well, it's used to give this sort of the overarching data points that the police chiefs need, that the politicians need, about as it relates to car theft or murder or otherwise. But those are the three major contributions that I walked away with. This idea of protection and the need to understand what protection means in these neighborhoods. The idea that we need to look deeper at this, at what it is to be a man and male culture, and I so resist this idea of machismo. I'm so not a fan of that notion. It just sort of gives people in other cultures a pass and kind of pushes this onto the sort of Latino culture. So I would talk about what it means to be a man. And then the third thing is this, sad, disheartening, circular nature of our responses to this, deportation, vigilantes, and mano dura. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. Now that we're all cheered up, appreciate that. We've heard a great set of comments, I think, and remarks. What I'm going to do now is open it up to, we don't have much time, but I'm going to open it up to you. Just please identify yourselves, be extremely brief, and we're going to collect a bunch of them and then come back very quickly for comments from up here. Why don't we start with, just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, I'm Hector from the Honduran Embassy, and I have a question for Stephen. Thank you all for what you do. So imagining that there's like a baseline number of mareros and gang members due to exclusion and lack of opportunities, what additional source of revenue in terms of narco trafficking, how much does that contribute to the headcount of the mareros, and what can be done in terms of domestic policy here in the U.S. to get rid of that part of the component?
Thanks. There's a guy next to you. I don't know his name, but.
Mark Schneider, currently senior advisor at CSIS. Thank everybody for their comments and the report as well. One question which I have had and which we've been writing about for Crisis Group for some time is is the U.S. government now providing to the governments of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras detailed information on the individuals who are being deported, so that when they are, in fact, and now something like 50%, I believe, are not with any criminal conviction, that you have an opportunity to try and provide some kind of program of reintegration into the country, but not into the same neighborhood, so they become victims of the gangs or gang members again. And are those programs beginning to scale up, the good programs beginning to scale up?
Great, thank you. Yes, please, and then we'll go over here.
Hi, my name is Audrey Vilanovich from the Inter-American Foundation. I have a question for Mr. Ivan Briscoe. You had mentioned that the gangs were reaching capacity within the triangle. Would you be able to expand on that? Thank you.
Thank you. We have some questions over here, please.
Louis Palooms, freelance journalist. We hear so much about journalists in Mexico, and can you talk about the relationship between the gangs and journalists who try and cover them in that region?
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Sarah Hall from the Central American Resource Center. I have two questions. One has to do with, you talked a little bit about your expectations for the US administration and hopefully no additional mass deportations and that sort of thing. But I'm wondering if you could expand upon that. And then also, I'm curious about how you could change the idea in civil society, because there is a lot of distrust about gang truces or even any sort of conversation with gangs. So how do you expect to be able to make that happen?
Thank you. Question over here, sir.
Hi, my name is Michael Maxey. I just did 6 months in Honduras on a workforce development program for youth. And what I came away with was the economic aspects of what's happening with gangs. Over a period from 1995 to 2015, we've seen the economically active population of Honduras double from 2 million to 4 million. Over the same period, we've seen unemployment and underemployment go from 30% to 60%. And during the same period, we've seen purchasing power decline. I mean, violence is part of this, but there really needs to be a focus on the economic aspects of what's happening.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, I'm sorry. We have then two more, one and then one in the back.
Hi, good morning. Jessica Gilbertson from the Department of State. I was wondering if any of our speakers could speak to the relationship between the gangs in El Salvador, particularly MS, and the cliques or programs here in the United States. Just any command and control or aspirations of the gangs to control the gangs here a little bit more.
Thank you. Yes, one in the back.
Giselle Tobias, journalist from Voice of America. Looks like nothing is working, like politicians already propose ideas, then organizations have spent a lot of time in these countries trying to help these kids, and the dialogue, it didn't work, and it looks like people is not willing to support that idea because it's gonna take too many years. So is there a short solution for this?
Short solution. Let me add one final comment, and then I'll go to Steve, Anna, and Yvonne to wrap it up. When Plan Colombia was around in 16, 17 years ago, and we were talking about it here in Washington, we tried to, the dialogue and other groups tried to talk about the complexities in Colombia. And one of the voices, people were skeptical about whether the US could have an effective, successful policy. And the reason was that the US was not known for its nuanced, sophisticated, subtle policy, that all of the complexities that you've been pointing out this morning almost seem, even if there were a different set of actors in administration, this was under the Clinton administration we're talking about. It's just, when Anna just struck by the differences that you're talking about, when you really get down, and if you're really going to have an effective, well-tailored, well-conceived, well-thought-out response, you'd really have to have a kind of understanding of these differences. And yet we see both at the national level and as well as from the United States, just, gangs. These are the way the gangs are. They're the ways in El Salvador, and the ways here, and they're the ways in Virginia, and the ways in, wherever. And so, how do you I mean, what basis do you have for any kind of hope that there's going to be a response that has an ability? I mean, even when problems are simple, it's hard to get policies, or when there aren't complexities, it's hard to get policies right. But when you have this and this evolving nature, which I think is important, that as Steve mentioned in his anecdote, the gangs, 5 years ago are not what the gangs are today, and so forth. And so a lot of policies also are based on understandings of a few years ago. And so you're out of date and you fail to capture the nuances. And I don't know, where does that leave us? Stop digging, right? Okay. Steve, Anna, and then we'll end with Yvonne.
You were complaining about us being depressing after.
Well, I don't know. I'm just trying to be realistic here.
Very, very quickly, a question about drug trafficking and how it contributes to the head count. Our notion is that there are relationships at the very local level of distribution, mostly connection between the gangs and the distributors. In some cases, they are pushing to become the wholesale distributors. In some very select cases, what we've seen is that there are, at the leadership level, they're trying to enter into the transnational criminal side of this, collecting or obtaining, small quantities, still very small quantities, and then becoming the transports. Being the transporters of those. I don't think that this is the thing about the gangs, is I don't think that this necessarily contributes to the head count one way or the other. I think the gangs have a completely different ethos. That's what differentiates the gangs from others. It's that their end game is something very different from a drug trafficking organization. Now, some of this, evolution is having an impact on head count, and that actually may be that some people are leaving the gang. Ironically enough, because of this emphasis more on the criminal economy than on what it is to be part of El Barrio. So, oddly enough, it kind of moves in the other direction than what you might think. But very minimal and very individual level of participation in international trafficking, maybe not even bringing or in consultation with the leadership, not bringing the gang along, or not in consultation with the leadership, or often a relationship that's developed in jail or other places, a network that's developed outside of the gang, or a sort of a relationship. In one case we looked at, the father was connected, he had a transport business, it was connected to a larger criminal organization. So that's the way that they were moving the drugs, not using the gang infrastructure. So in any case, that it just, with regards to journalism in Central America, there was a case of a documentary filmmaker, Christian Podea, who was assassinated by gang members after he'd finished his documentary. There are various stories about why that happened. There are a constant, it's a fairly constant threat to people who are doing this, but I emphasize that this threat is local journalists, these guys who live there and work there all the time. I mean, not the parachute guys like me who pop in there and talk to them and then leave. The major threat for these guys is the local, and they're treading very difficult water, of course, because of the dynamic situation. So you've got atomizing gang structures, you've got differing relationship that is becoming a higher stakes game as it relates to, for example, the politicians. So if you start putting impediments on the public works projects or other sort of mechanisms by which they're going to receive a lot of money, then that could raise the stakes. So there are various reasons to believe that the stakes are getting higher and higher for covering gangs. And so I would presume that would have more direct impact. If not, I would expect more journalists to kind of leave the area and go back. We've already seen that as well. We've gotten a lot of colleagues who are threatened and leave for a while and then go back, and et cetera. There's also the relationship that they're reporting on the attacks on the gangs. So the police, so they're reporting on how the police are extrajudicially executing the gang members, and this, of course, puts them at huge risk. So. And then one last thing with regards to the gangs in El Salvador and the programs and cliques in the United States, there is some There is some interaction. It's minimal from what we can tell. There are minimal number of cases that have evolved from these interactions, and that they're not. They're of course part of the same sort of el barrio notion, nominal notion, but they are not necessarily communicating, and there's no sort of general plan to move people, from south to north or north to south. There's no grand master plan. They're taking advantage of circumstances that present themselves. I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Steve. Anna, any thoughts you want to?
Okay, more in regard with the case of the U.S. politics, I think one of the main problems that I find in general, not just for U.S., is that there is it's more easy to decide that you have an enemy in a specific place and that you need to take some type of hard hands measures to solve. And I think in the last couple of years, it was a big debate inside of the U.S. Institutions to see how to begin asking if they treat the issue of the youth gangs in a different way with what is the historical way to give an incidence in the Central American region. But I think still it was in the debate. Now it was the change into the government. And I think we still wait for what will be the new policy in the countries. Probably for some type of, I think, some issues that it was saying by the president, I think it's more easy to use the phenomenon of the gangs as the threat that you are having here in US from the North Triangle countries that are coming here, exporting those bad guys to here, more than to see that the phenomenon was on the contrary. Was people that migrate to US and that here learn some of the modalities of the gangs, and after to export to the Central America countries. And now we don't have anymore the group of people that is linked directly with the US, with LA, but there are some interrelations, as Steve said before, between them in a different way. And then for me, the problem is that if you don't see the nuances in the phenomenon, then you cannot give the specific answers to give a positive solutions, and then we continue going in the same and in the same and in the same. The second is in regard with the opportunities for integration of all the deportees in Central America. Our experience is that is really one of the points in which there are not too much organizations doing something. Most of them come back and they are just looking for some type of relationship with some specific groups to see if that is the way that they can have an opportunity to go and to survive in the country, especially some of the people that come back and don't have families anymore there, don't have even, in some cases, even they don't speak the language. And then this is the easy way is to go through the youth gangs in some cases. And what they are trying to do always is to see how they will come back. And then they just look for some type of networks to come back again to the US. I think there is nothing structured. And for us, we were at some point knowing from some of the programs from the OAMs, and it wasn't too much to give an opportunity. It was more to give the comeback to them into the airport, but not more than that. In regard with the civil society perspective, I think this is very important thing. My impression is that depend on what civil society you are talking about, if it's in the case of Guatemala, in El Salvador, or in Honduras. If you are talking about El Salvador, my impression is that in El Salvador you have a polarized situation between the people that is follow the political party that is right now in the power and the groups of the private sector that follow Arena. And in this sense, the problem is that in that polarization, for some civil society organization to accept some of the policies that the government is doing right now is like give an advantage to the right political party. And then they prefer to maintain in a mute way to avoid some type of implications that can support the other political party. I think in some cases they were very open saying that to us. In other cases, I think it's more like to continue trying to support their own political party. And the problem is that in the middle, if you don't have a civil society, a strong civil society that can talk and that can oversight the government independently of the political party, then I think we are in troubles. And I think this is the case right now in El Salvador. And just the last one, I think it was, for me, the economical issue is the key for the resolve the problem. But sometimes for me, it's not too much about to think in the big ideas of how we can really transform the states with a different economical situation. I think in some cases it's more about, at least when it was the truth in the case of El Salvador, the talks with them, it was to try to see how they can transit from the situation that in which they are living from the extortions to a new situation in which needs to have the involvement of the private sector, of the government, and from the civil society. I think part of the problem is not too much about how much economical solution you can give, but it's more how you transit from that type of illegal economy that sustain these kind of countries to a different kind of economy. And the problem is that even in the private sector, you don't have too much inversion. And they are not investment, and they don't have too much, capacity to invest in a country in which they are not secure that the things will continue going well, is what at least the private sector said directly to us, especially in the case of El Salvador. And the big problem for us is that for them it's more important to have some type of collective efforts in which they can be involved as a group in the productive possibilities, that to go into the private companies that already exist, because in that way they need to go in a more individual way, and they want to continue going and having all their mechanisms as a group. And for us that was a learning, in which is why we don't believe too much in the issue when they said, I am calm and I can go for a job in a specific private sector. It's better when they have as a group. And then I think there is a lot of issues that are linked with this, but this is not just to see the economical thing. I think this goes for the change in the social pact that you have in this type of countries. Because if you don't have involved all the sectors with the same interest, then the problem is that every group is going for their own interest, and then the youth gangs are just one more that is in the middle of this lack of understanding in between all the actors.
Thank you. Ivan, you have the final word, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'll refer first of all to the question on capacity. This comes from the sort of conversations I've had with Anna Glenda. I mean, if you look at El Salvador, what the matters are both the support network for the members, and they're also a criminal organization. The extortion sort of suits both, because all the revenues from extortion can come from their control over communities and territories and be distributed all equally. But the problem is there's not enough to go around. They don't get enough from extortion, and they can't really get any more, because with a big extortion economy, there are other actors as well, non-gang actors, who are also putting their hands in the extortion pot. So let's say the Maras are estimated to get, the MS-13 rather, is estimated to get something like $30 million a year from extortion. That comes out, and this was a report which El Faro were involved in last year. It comes to about $15 per head per month, which is absolutely miserable. Similar figures come out in Guatemala as a result of the investigations and the clampdown on extortion economies last year. So the idea is, if you want to get more money as a Mara organization, you have to branch off into more lucrative criminal activities. But in doing more lucrative criminal activities, you become a more typical criminal organization, more hierarchical, with difference between what the top and the bottom get, less horizontal. So this is a tension. I would say the Mara model has got questions around it, but whether we're going to start seeing huge splits, which the government of El Salvador is desperate to see, just trying very hard to see, it wants to split the Mara Salvatrucha, it wants to see the Barrio 18 form new wings. Whether that's going to happen in quite the way the government intends there, it's another matter. Very quickly, yes, civil society is extremely difficult to change. I think you have to constantly be aware of the atrocities which have taken place in these countries and the murders of innocent civilians and the huge resentment which is generated against Mara activities, both in their own communities and more broadly and therefore I think rather than saying sit down, have a dialogue, face-to-face talks with the Maras, I don't think that's a possibility at the moment. It may be desirable, but it's not politically feasible. It would generate so much opposition and so much antagonism. Why we propose moving towards non-face-to-face negotiations, not even negotiations, signaling, an exchange, as it were, which can be mediated by church figures, civil society figures. Why this is a possible model is because it generates tangible results. I don't think there will be any possibility of changing civil society's perceptions until there are results on the table. Serious reductions in violence, a veto on recruitment in schools, free movement through the zones which are controlled by the gangs. This is absolutely essential. Following deportees, I think this is a question of El Salvadorian or Northern Triangle state capacity, which is hugely problematic. We'll talk about that later, Mark. As for the very last thing, which is the question of a short solution, no, there are none. But there are new policies out there, which I unfortunately didn't get round to. And particularly looked to Guatemala's anti-extortion policy, changing the nature of prisons, so starting to look towards ways that non-violent or not extremely violent offenders can be kept out of prison, so that there'll be a form of monitoring, of tagging of those prisoners, which is something which I don't think any Northern Triangle country has really experimented with. So new forms of prosecution and control would be interesting, trying to stop the effect of prisons on these gangs. But I just want to give you an example. In Guatemala, where the most progress has been made, which is still really at the vanguard of dealing with issues of crime at the top and at the bottom, as it were, you still see a problem. In Guatemala, you had the targeting of public transports, the killing of bus drivers 7 or 8 years ago. Absolute atrocities taking place on a daily basis. That was stopped, largely because many buses stopped going through Mara-controlled areas. Then you had the persecution of small businesses, extortion of small businesses. And then when those small businesses closed down, what you start to see now in the marginal areas of Guatemala City are extortion going from house to house, knocking on the doors and hitting the households. There is no short solution because it moves from one opportunity to the next. And therefore you have to bear in mind the totality of the situation.
Thank you, Ivan, for that sobering note, but also pointing to some promise of some of the changes, which I think is important to take into account. I apologize for going over time a little bit, but I think this has been a really terrific session, illuminating, not always upbeat, but illuminating, thought-provoking, and I want to thank International Crisis Group, congratulate them on their report. Thank Ivan and Ana Glenda for coming and sharing their insights and perspective, and of course, thanks, Steve, for his always brilliant commentary, and also congratulate you on Inside Crime and all the great work that you're doing. And thank you all very, very much for joining us this morning. We'll be following up with other events on this issue and other related questions as well, because this is obviously not going to go away. It's high on the agenda in the region, and I think here in Washington as well. So thank you all very, very much for joining us.